Here's a points chart for the Constructors Championship so far this year, and until you realise that I'm using a logarithmic y-axis, it looks like we've had a pretty close battle. Unfortunately, this is what we're really dealing with. The writing has been on the wall, or the trophy I suppose, for a while now, as Max and Red Bull look to claim their third and second back-to-back Drivers' and Constructors' Championships respectively. Luckily though, we do have a fight on, it's just a duel for the silver medal and not the gold. And heading into Japan, for this video, we're going to take a look through the year so far in this fight between Mercedes, Ferrari and Aston Martin, to give us an idea about how it could all end up after Abu Dhabi. Let's start with Mercedes then, the Silver Arrows. In their own eyes, and those of many analysts, apart from Lando Norris, they're the team with the strongest driver lineup on the 2023 grid, and they have the current points lead in our fight for second place. The chapter of the zero pod, unstable machinery and the bouncing seems to have been finally closed for good, and at last weekend's Singapore Grand Prix, Mercedes and most notably Lewis were flying at full pace back through the field on those mediums, chasing down the lead in anger, fighting for what they feel they deserve, Grand Prix wins. And zooming out a little, P2 for Lewis Hamilton in the notoriously chaotic Australian Grand Prix was the first of many strong results, as Lewis sought to bounce back from being beaten by his teammate over a season's distance in 2022, for the first time since Nico Rosberg did it for the title in 2016. This line graph from Formula1Points.com tells the story rather well of the season so far. Aston Martin's fast start was usurped by Mercedes' consistency, their strong driver pairing, and their successfully iterative upgrade packages. The three best races for Mercedes so far have been Spain, Silverstone and arguably Singapore, given that until Russell's crash they did have two cars on fresh tyres within seconds of the lead of a Grand Prix for the first time since Brazil. Another flashpoint of success for Mercedes was back in Hungary as Lewis Hamilton crossed the timing beam to put his car in pole position, and even if it only lasted until the first corner in the next day's race, it was still a huge moment for the sponsors and the motivation of the Mercedes factory, watching their car take the headlines, take first place in a competitive race session. And if we take a look here at this chart which shows average qualifying and race positions between these three teams, we can see how Mercedes have been able to gain all these points. By moving forward in the races rather than back, they can build off of decent qualifying performances to take real points in the race, 3rd, 5th, 6th. This is really where they've been in basically every round. They're still undeniably missing that feel and the smoothness that they had back with the W11 back in 2020, and it seems like Red Bull have really found that this year, at every race apart from Singapore. But Mercedes undeniably are now favourites to bring home P2 in the standings, right? And this is crucial for many reasons, economically, in recruitment, in sponsorship, but also primarily that at the start of the year they were being beaten by Aston Martin, which is pretty embarrassing as the Aston Martin is effectively in MotoGP terms a customer team that was beating the factory with its own parts. So Mercedes so far this year, 289 points, a pretty solid tally that puts them firmly second so far. And just behind that we get to Ferrari with 265. When a child draws a car, he colours it in red, is a quote attributed to Enzo Ferrari back in the 20th century as his Italian giant rose to dominate the art of supercar design and the motorsport worlds of both endurance and of Formula One. For the first time in a very, very long time, I guess going back to Fernando Alonso and Kimi and Massa before that, Charles Leclerc in 2022 seemed like Ferrari's first chance to win a real title in Formula One. But unfortunately, over the distance of a season, the combined pace of the Red Bull, the mistakes of Ferrari and the development gap meant that they weren't able to bring the title home. That loss of the lead in Monaco for Charles Leclerc was a fantastic crescendo of Ferrari just being Ferrari and not quite getting it right. But for 2023, Mattia Binotto is out and new team principal Fred Vasseur is looking to change things around for the team. Leclerc's own team orders and preferences seem to have been falling away as Carlos Sainz has gained pace, and it seems like they're now roughly equal in the team. Of course, Carlos Sainz's recent uptick in form maybe even putting him ahead of Leclerc on strategy preference in the following rounds. If we go back to our average quali graph, we can see the specialities of the drivers and the car in the numbers here. Ferrari have qualified better than Mercedes, but fallen back, only very slightly though. The flashpoints of joy for the Tifosi have really come in the last two rounds. Of course, in Monza, Carlos Sainz taking pole position, leading Max for the first 10 laps, holding him off with real top speed until he made that mistake and locked up and gave it up. Then you add the battle for 3rd and 4th, the intra-team battle between Leclerc and Sainz, making Fred Vasseur extremely nervous on the pit wall, making all the fans get to the edge of their seats watching the Ferraris fight for valuable positions. Then in Singapore, Sainz took another awesome pole position, put a lap together across the changing surface, the heat and the pressure of knowing that it was his time to shine when Red Bull were out of the running. Even little things like starting Leclerc on the soft tyre to give him the jump at the start, successfully pulling that off and then managing the race pace from there with their drivers in 1-2 is really critical to demonstrate not only to Ferrari, but also to all the fan bases in Formula One that Ferrari are a serious team who can make it count when they're under the pressure. What they weren't able to do in races like Monaco last year, they've been able to show that they can do this year. On the other hand though, Binotto was able to get the team to finish P2 in the standings last year, so if they stay where they are now and finish P3, actually they will have dropped back in Vasseur's first year in charge, even though it feels like they're moving forward so much in the recent rounds, which is a little bit of a weird perceptive thing to think about. And one strength, or potential weakness I suppose, that Ferrari have in this battle is that they're technically independent of the other teams, whereas Aston Martin and Mercedes are connected, right? Aston Martin have the Mercedes engine, so any technical gains that are made by Mercedes in that part will be passed over to Aston Martin, which is why it was so embarrassing at the start of the year that Aston Martin were winning that fight. So Aston Martin then, on 217 points at the minute, they were the fast starters this year. It was the move that no one quite understood until we got running in testing it in Bahrain. Alonso leaving Alpine for Aston now seemed like a masterstroke from the old dog. But unfortunately, the at best unbalanced driver lineup within the team means that the waiting for points looks like this. It's not ideal when you're up against two factory teams with extremely well-matched pairings like we spoke about earlier. Again though, like many instances in Formula One, short memories do play a role. If we cast our minds back to Alonso driving up the inside left wheel of Lewis Hamilton's Mercedes in Bahrain, it was like a dream. Fernando was at the right team at the right time. They had a foundational car the whole season ahead of them to spray champagne, climb pit walls, and maybe even get that 33rd victory. But since Fernando took an incredible 6 podiums in the first 8 races, there's only been one further trip to the rostrum since Canada. It's been more like top 10s than top 3s, and this is partly due to the factory outfit's upgrade schedule being more heavily weighted towards this part of the season rather than front-loading it like Aston Martin did. And you can see exactly how that played out if we go back to our line chart. Even with the huge financial backing though, and the new Silverstone factory that is as impressive as anything in Formula One, we should still be grading Aston Martin on a slightly different curve to the factory outfits. I mean, they were P7 last year, right? They scored 55 points throughout the entire year, and in 4 races, Alonso had that tally beaten on his own. I used MotoGP terms earlier, and now I'm going to talk boxing because it just feels like for Aston Martin, they're really in a one-handed fight, like a welterweight that's jumped up weight classes to take on 2 experienced heavyweights. It just doesn't really quite seem like a fair fight when they've got one hand tied behind their back. So looking to the rest of the year then, we've got a huge range of different circuit dynamics coming up across the calendar. Places like Brazil, Vegas, Mexico, it's going to be a real different challenge at each of these circuits for the technical packages, and being adaptable across all of them will be the real way to bring home the points. There's also going to be reliability and engine penalties likely coming in at some point, so expect to see some kind of comeback drive storylines where a driver moves back in qualifying because of a penalty and has to overtake during the race. It could make it pretty exciting. So plenty to look forward to, but for now I'll say thank you very much for watching. Check out our website crash.net for motorsport coverage from our team across the racing world, and check back in next week where we can review all the action from the Japanese Grand Prix.